A warm welcome to everyone that is joining us right here at the end of June. Hopefully, some of you all are enjoying some much deserved time off and rest to kind of recharge your batteries because we all know in education that that's something that is vitally important. Um, Before we actually get started with the meeting, I do want to very quickly, if I have anyone on this meeting that is not in some way receiving some type of communications update from either myself or someone on my team, and it's being maybe forwarded from your principal or someone at the district. If you yourself are a principal, assistant principal, or you work at central office somewhere, and you would be interested in receiving updates on upcoming events with Kentucky Department of Education and also KVEC. Mary is very wonderful about sharing all the upcoming events. And I also have a relationship with Abby Labor at KEDC. And I know that a lot of the members of KVEC are also members of KEDC. So my team and I send out updates on upcoming events that might be of interest in literacy. The last one that I sent out included some opportunities for middle school ELA teachers. And I know that that's something that a lot of schools have asked about. And so if that is something that you're not a part of the communications and you would like to be, if you would just put your name and what county you're from, so that way I can add you to my communication list, that would be very helpful. And I'll send out the next communications list. I'll add you to it. I also include in that at the Division of Early Literacy, which is what I'm part of. We have monthly virtual office hours, and that is an hour and a half time where you have members of the Dale team that are there available to answer any questions. It's also a really great place to just kind of come and hang out and listen to what other people across the state are doing in their districts or their schools or their with their students. So it's just a really great opportunity to kind of connect with people and get some of that networking for across the state. So if you're not part of that list, just go ahead and put your name and what school you're from. Okay, so Eliza, so with the middle school, I do send out communications to Linda Calhoun. Do you get the forwarded email? Because if you don't, I do not care not one bit to add you to it. I'll actually just go ahead and write down your name and go ahead and add you to it. Because like I said, there is 2 or 3 different opportunities for middle school ELA teachers that are coming up in July and early August that you might be interested in. And there's actually there's 2 in Ashland, so that would be really great for you.
We've got the writing revolution in Morgan County, which is pretty close to them too.
Yeah. So you can go ahead and add that in the chat, and I'm not really good at being able to read the chat while I'm going, but
I'll
okay.
I'll watch it for you.
Okay, let me just jot down Caitlin. And Caitlin, if you don't care, are you an elementary teacher or do you do middle?
Elementary,
okay.
Pike County.
Pike County. Okay. So just take a moment to look at the norms for this meeting and just kind of let's all take one and kind of keep it at our heart and our soul and just kind of keep ourselves beholden to it. I'm actually going to do that myself. I'm turning off my ringer and I'm putting my phone behind me so I will not be distracted about it because I want to make sure that I'm engaged the whole entire time. So if you don't care, just go ahead and take a moment to kind of take one of those and hold yourself responsible for keeping that norm. Now, before we continue, I do want to do a quick poll. If you don't care to drop in the chat, what is your role? So I need to know who my audience is. You can just put either admin or you can put teacher just really quick. Okay, superintendent. Okay, great. So I see a really good mixture of reading interventionists, teachers, admin, principals, central office staff. So that gives me a really good kind of lens to kind of focus this. So thank you for responding. So, of course, I want to make sure that I set the goals and the intentions for today's learning. Today, the goals are to be able to explain why Kentucky's shift to structured literacy is necessary, and also to have a more clear understanding of what structured literacy is. You're not going to leave this meeting being knowing everything there is to know about structured literacy, but it is my goal for you to have a really good understanding of why Kentucky's making this shift away from balanced literacy more towards structured literacy, and exactly what structured literacy, that's kind of become a term that's been thrown around with the reading wars. And then I just realized I haven't formally introduced myself. My name is Marsha Ward. This is my 25th year in education. Most of those 25 years have been spent working directly with students. As a matter of fact, when I took this position as State Regional Literacy Director last year, this is the first year in all those years that I have not worked directly with students. So even prior to that, when I was an instructional coach for the district, I still worked with children on a day-to-day basis. So whenever I tell you something and I'm talking about in a classroom, please understand that I have been there. I have done that. I have multiple t-shirts because you know how it is when you're a teacher, you get all the t-shirts, you get all the holiday t-shirts and all the class t-shirts and all the every time that one of the cheerleaders or the basketball team or the football team selling a t-shirt, I literally have all the t-shirts. So whenever I tell you something, please understand that I have been in a teacher's shoes for multiple years for most of my experience. And that experience includes most of it in the fourth and fifth grade ELA classroom, but also with fourth and fifth grade social studies. I have worked with kindergarten, first, second. I have taught third grade, I've taught sixth grade, and I've worked with seventh and eighth grade students. So my experience is in the K-8 classroom. And the only one I haven't really worked much with is preschool. And unfortunately, I haven't worked much with high school. Although that is something that as I found myself getting older in my years, I felt like, I could maybe handle high school students. I don't know if I would have been quite ready for that whenever I was in my first 10 years of teaching. But so that's who I am. And currently I serve as one of the 5 state regional literacy directors with the Kentucky Department of Education, the Division of Early Literacy, and I represent the southeastern part of the state. So it's most of the area that KVEC serves, including a little bit down into the most southern part of the state. So if you have a question about literacy and you're like, I don't know who to ask, I'm kind of your liaisons between KDE. So you don't have to sit there and go, oh, who could I ask this question of? You actually know you can ask that question of me. Actually, the last slide has my email address. So that way help me to help you. So if there's something that you need, just shoot me an email. I really don't mind. I actually enjoy getting to connect with people in this area because my true love is for the kids in this area and making sure that the kids in our area have the same opportunities that any child living anywhere in the United States has, because these are the kids that we see every day. So that's who I am, and that's like kind of like my soapbox that I'll get off of. So our goal for today is to understand why Kentucky's shifting toward structured literacy, and then what is structured literacy. So to kind of frame our thinking and to get us into the right mindset, I want us to define our goals for literacy. So our goals for literacy, so think about your, let me just copy that real quick and put it in the chat. So I want you to take the next 2 to 3 minutes and access that Figma board that I just dropped into the chat and write down what you think the goal of literacy is for students in either your school or your district. So what is that goal for literacy? So if you don't care, go ahead and click on that link in the chat and it should take you directly to that Figma board.
I'm not seeing that, Marcia. Did you, when you dropped it
Oh,
in the chat,
oh,
did it say to everyone?
oh, nope, it didn't. It went to Eliza because she was the last one I messaged. I'm so
That
sorry.
happens. That happens to me all the time.
I'm so sorry. Well, Eliza was probably already on it. She's like, I don't know what's
Yeah.
wrong with the rest
She's
of
like,
you all. Go ahead
well,
and go to it. Oh, now do we see it?
now I see it.
Yay. So, Mary, if you don't care, Denise Baker said that she dropped in a little late. You may need to put back in the sign-in
I
code.
private messaged her.
Oh,
Thank
okay.
you.
There we go. So you just grab one of those little Post-it notes and you can just type right on the Post-it note. So what is the goal of literacy for the students in your school or district? Oh, I like that. To learn more about the world around them. Ooh, independent. Oh, the ability to communicate.
Dr. Hamilton asked, where do I get a posted note to be able to
They're
do this?
they're actually down in it actually looks like a little Post-it note. It's right beside the ink pen that's in
Okay.
yep, it says sticky note.
I was struggling with the same thing. I'm glad
Oh,
because I
that's
hadn't got there
okay.
yet. I
I'm
was
glad that
checking.
you asked because that's what I always say anytime that I'm hesitant to ask a question and I finally get up the gumption to ask it, then I'm always tickled to death when someone else is like, "Oh, I wondered the same thing. I'm so glad you said that."
Yeah. I was looking for it and I was like, okay, I know it's here.
And so for some of you all that might go, oh, this is kind of neat. This is something that actually Misty Higgins and Fox Des Moines used in a communities of practice session that I was in because they were looking at a alternative to Jamboard because as we all know, Jamboard is disappearing. And if you want to kind of play around after you get finished with your sticky note, you'll see down there in the toolbar at the bottom, it looks like the old school stamp. You can actually do reactions to other people's Post-it notes in it. So I'm just kind of looking over some of these and I see think critically to seek out information and to learn about the world, to be able to communicate with the world, to be able to explore and learn and share new information, and to gain the skills to become independent learners, and for students to feel more comfortable with written and verbal expression so they can become better citizens and lifelong learners. Absolutely. Develop language skills. I love that I see phonological awareness in there. Produce independent readers. Oh, this is you're really speaking to my heart, Misty Tackett. My goal is to help produce independent readers to enjoy the love of reading. And I think that that's something that maybe we get caught up in test scores sometimes, which, rightfully so. There's a lot of emphasis placed on that, especially if you're a classroom teacher or you're a principal or a superintendent. Um, but that's the one thing that we as adults, especially if you also love to read, we know that that's one of the greatest joys in reading is just the love of reading and to be able to share that with another person. So I really want us to kind of think about what our goals are for literacy. What do we want for our kids here in the eastern part of the state? We want them to become lifelong learners. We want them to be able to learn all throughout their life without having to depend on someone else. We want them to have a love of reading. We want them to be able to be independent. And so when we think about if we can provide our students with this, how much better will that be for the kids in our area or any area? But, specifically, I like to think about it for the eastern part of the state. How would that change our area? How would that change our future in the eastern part of the state? If we were able to take all of these wonderful ideas that you all shared, if we were able to take all of those and we were able to impart that with our students. And ultimately, that is our goal to be able to do that. So thank you all so much for sharing Figma. So, tip if you would like to, if you're looking for something to replace Jamboard, you can try out Figma. You get so many for free, and then I think you have to pay for it, but it's something to play around with. So we've already read over some of the other responses. Now, let's take this moment to really dive into why is Kentucky making this shift? Probably a lot of you all on this call have heard about the Read to Succeed Act and know that Kentucky's making this shift and they're changing things. Sometimes we tend to change things quite often in education. But I really like to, because again, most of my experience was as a teacher and I was a student, and the type of student that I was I wasn't the best student. I always loved telling my students that because they thought it was hilarious. They assumed that every teacher was like the best student, straight A, teacher's pet. And so whenever they learned that I was not that type of student and I got into trouble quite often, and then they would say, Miss Ward, why did you get in trouble? And I would say, because of my mouth every single time. It's because my mouth every single time. I would always, when a teacher would tell me to do something, I would always ask that dreaded question that has been asked of every teacher that has ever given a kid an assignment to do. I was that kid that always said, why? I wanted to know why I had to do it. Why? So I always like to go ahead and tell everyone the why. And I think that sometimes we leave that out and we jump right to that this is what you're going to do or you need to do without kind of setting it up. This is why you're doing it. So why is Kentucky making all these changes specifically to literacy? One of the favorite quotes that I've heard here recently, and again, I was a fifth grade reading teacher. If you've ever taught fifth grade, you know that those poor fifth grade students are kind of like those poor eighth grade students. They are tested in everything. And so this quote really spoke to me. Data is information, not defamation. So, we have to be able to separate it. This is not defamation. This is not an attack on teachers because you know what? Teachers go in and they work their hardest and they try their best and they do everything that they know how to do every single day. But data is really good information. So let's take a look at some of that data. So just a quick moment. Some of you all may have seen this before, but I want you to look at this graph that shows the K-Prep and the KSA proficiency results from 2016 all the way up to 2023. We're not comparing them because we can't compare them because they're two totally different tests. But if you don't care, just take 1 second and put in the chat, what is a trend or something that you notice between 2016 and 2023? What are some things that kind of stick out to you? If you don't care, just go ahead and put that in the chat. Or if someone is feeling really brave, they can come off of mute and share what they notice. Oh, Mr. Hamilton said, yeah, that 2020 year, after that 2020 year, we learned in-person learning really matters. Because we saw a huge dip in test results coming back from COVID. We all know COVID was something we all had to live through, and we know what it did to our students. If you look at okay, it does look like we jumped back really quickly. So you'll see that 2021, we were at 29.8%, and then we're climbing our way back. We're rebuilding. So what do you notice overall? So if you were just going to take those percentages overall, what would you say? What's your big takeaway from the percentages? Okay, Eliza, the scores are still low overall. So if you look closely, even in our highest year, which was 2017, we were still sitting at less than 60%. Less than 60% of our students in 3rd grade were reading at a proficient level. And if you take the average, just like Mr. Hamilton put in the chat, we're sitting still at about 50%. So only about half of our 3rd graders are leaving 3rd grade able to read at a proficient level. So you might say, yeah, we hear this all the time about 3rd grade, 3rd grade, 3rd grade, but what's the significance of that 3rd grade threshold? Why do we look at 3rd grade? Well, so I'm going to put up some statistics over here. So if students are reading proficient or above at the end of 3rd grade, these are some of the things that research has shown. So depending on your school or district, some of these may really speak to you a little bit stronger than others. For example, I connect very strongly to the last bullet, that students that are reading at a proficient or above level by the end of grade 3 are more likely to break the cycle of intergenerational poverty. And of course, I don't know about the backgrounds of the people on this call. I will tell you that me personally, I grew up in poverty. I was born and raised right here in Perry County, still live in Perry County, went to school at Alice Lloyd College in Knott County. So it's not even like I went far away for college, and taught in Perry County for 23 years. And I grew up in poverty. But I also grew up in a home that my mother loved to read, and she instilled that love of reading in me from a very early age, even before I knew how to read. I had a love of reading. And so I know that I was able to break that cycle of poverty because of the education that I was able to receive. And one of the reasons why I was able to get that level of education was because I was a successful reader. So even if there were things that I was confused about in my upper science classes or social studies classes or history classes, I was able to read and learn more and to teach myself, just like how some of y'all were saying on the Figma board, that you become lifelong learners. And so I know that the education was the reason that I was able to break that cycle of poverty. Some of you all may be in a school or a district right now that you have a high absenteeism. So when we think, and I know a lot of schools, especially after COVID, really got hit hard with students' absences. And so when we think about those students, and we all had them, how many of those students that are in absence, that they miss a lot of school, that you are pretty sure that one of the main reasons why they miss school is because that they're a struggler. They struggle in reading, they struggle in their classes, and they do anything they can to avoid having to participate in classes, including not coming to school. And when we see that after COVID, we know that there was a lot of students, because it wasn't an equitable experience for our students, especially here in Eastern Kentucky when COVID hit, because not everyone had access to reliable internet. Not every child had someone at home that was capable or willing to help them with the work that they were given, or to even make sure that they did their work. And so you had some of those students that were already struggling that missed up to a year, depending on your school. And when you went back to school, may have missed up to a whole entire year of instruction. And then they come back. And those gaps that they had are still there. So I'm not trying to be like a complete pill buzz, but this is significant when we think about why we look at third grade specifically. So we know all this, and then we look at the student demographics and what's happened to how many of our students in different demographics are reading at a proficient level. So when we look at the economically disadvantaged, 62% of third graders in Kentucky that were identified as being economically disadvantaged, 62% of those students were below proficient. Our students with disabilities, 69% of those students were below proficient. So that's kind of alarming, and it should be alarming. That's kind of what we're here for. But numbers in a chart are numbers in a chart. Sometimes, that doesn't hit everyone the way that it should. So I always like to think about it this way. Looking at the fourth grade, the NAEP data for our fourth grade students, if we were to walk into a classroom that has these 10 fourth graders in it, so according to the NAEP results, and that's the NAEP results from 2022, I think was the last time that we had the NAEP results. So when we look at that, well, that student would not be a proficient reader, or that one, or that one. So on the NAEP data, only 32% of our fourth graders are proficient or above. So only only 3 of 10 students in a classroom of fourth graders would be considered reading at a proficient or above level. And there's not one single teacher in the state of Kentucky, there's not one single teacher in the United States of America or the world that gets up every single morning, drinks their coffee, showers, gets their teacher lunch together in their bag, drives to school probably before the sun rises, teaches all day, sometimes doesn't return home until after the sun sets. There's not one single educator in the world that would ever be okay with saying, yeah, out of these 10 kids, I'm okay with just 3 of them being able to read. Or walking into a third grade classroom in Kentucky and saying, I'm okay with only 6 out of 10 being able to read, or 5 out of 10 being able to read. We want better for our students. Of course we do. So we know why Kentucky is starting to make these shifts. We know that there were some alarming trends, and it's not new trends. We could see in that chart from 2016 to 2023, even before the pandemic, we were sitting right at about 50% of our third graders reading at a proficient level. So we know why we needed to make a shift. What's that old adage? If you do doing the same thing over and over again and expecting different results is the definition of insanity. So we know we have to change. So how is Kentucky how did they begin this change? And so one of the first approaches is the Read to Succeed Act. And that's something I'm sure that most of you all are familiar with, or you may not be familiar with it. So I do want to take a minute to kind of go over it. The Read to Succeed Act was actually a multifaceted approach to improve the literacy outcomes from all students. And it includes early intervention and instruction, state professional learning support strategies, reading improvement plans, family and community engagement, and then the missing piece that we all knew was there, teacher certification. So the early intervention and instruction, the instruction would be the high quality instructional resource adoption, and we'll talk about that here in a little bit. That professional learning support, that is actually the Kentucky Reading Academies. And right now, the Kentucky Reading Academies is offering the LETRS training. And this is the third cohort of the LETRS training. As of right now, this will be the last time that LETRS training is offered for free to any Kentucky public school educator, K through 5. But I want everyone on this call to understand that's not the only professional learning support. Right now, it's LETRS, but rolling out this year coming up, so the 2024-2025, the Kentucky Reading Academies are also going to be offering, with the help of one of our partners, our national partners, it's a TNTP, the New Teacher Project, is offering a Science of Reading teacher courses. And so that's going to be this first one that we're going to have. There's going to be 250 teachers will be able to take the elementary course, and 750 teachers will be able to take the secondary course. So there's going to be a pathway for Science of Reading courses for elementary teachers that are only a year. So they're not as much of a time commitment that LETRS is. But then there's also going to be an offering for middle school. And again, that's something that a lot of schools and a lot of principals and superintendents have been asking for a long time. And again, as a 5th grade reading teacher at heart, I hear you. There's not a lot of opportunities for middle school ELA, but that is something that's also going to be addressed this upcoming year. So if you're not kind of keeping up with KDE's website, and trust me, I know sometimes it can be a heavy lift to actually go on there and find stuff. Just look up Kentucky Reading Academies and kind of keep a check on that, because again, this first course that they're offering, there's only going to be 250 spots for elementary, and there's only going to be 750 for the secondary course. So it's going to be kind of limited this first year. It's going to be the pilot year to see how it works out. And then hopefully, if everything goes well, there will be more coming up. And of course, the reading improvement plans. I know a lot of you all are familiar with it. Originally, that was for any K through 3 student that scored below benchmark on the universal screener. And then we're being given a diagnostic assessment. And this reading improvement plan was a way to communicate with parents early that their child was having some difficulties in reading. On a personal note, as a 5th grade teacher, there were multiple times that students and parents didn't know that their child was struggling in reading until they had a data meeting with me. And it breaks my heart, and it always broke my heart to see a 5th grader understand for the first time, truly understand for the first time, that they weren't where they needed to be in reading. And so, there is. And I know I hear a lot of people say, well, some of these parents don't care, and that may be true, but there's a lot of parents out there that do care. So, getting those parents in there and letting them know early if their child is having some difficulties in reading is very, very important. Now, like I said, last year it was for kindergarten through 3rd grade. This upcoming school year, the reading improvement plans will be extended into 4th grade. So before it was just kindergarten, 1st, 2nd, 3rd. Now it's going to be kindergarten, 1st, 2nd, 3rd, and 4th grade students. So those 4th graders that did not score proficient on the KSA will then be considered for a reading improvement plan this next year. And I'm sure that's probably, if you all were able to attend the Kentucky Reads to Succeed, um, Reads to Succeed Summer Conference, and you all attended the session with Christy Biggerstaff and Ashley Hill, you all probably already heard that. And then, of course, we have the family and community engagement. If you have seen the Read at Home plan that KDE put out, there's lots of really great information on how parents can, if their child's struggling with phonemic awareness or phonics or one of those other areas, it's some really good practical things that parents can do at home to support that learning that don't require them to go out and buy a bunch of materials or make a bunch of things. And then last but not least, we have the teacher certification. And the Educational Professional Standard Boards actually approved the Praxis Teaching Reading Elementary Test as an evaluation of reading instruction knowledge and skills. And it starts August the 1st, 2024. So this year, teachers that are seeking certification for teaching elementary school will be required to complete that assessment. So if you're like me and you went to school, long, long ago, and you went to college a long time ago, I actually was not taught how to teach a child to read in my teacher prep program. Um, I wasn't taught phonics. I didn't learn to read by phonics. I blame that on why I'm such a horrendous speller. And if you held a gun to my head and said, spell the word restaurant or you're gone, I would just have to say goodbye to everybody because that's one of those words that I just can't spell, and I misspell receive all the time. So I blame that, some of my own shortcomings on the fact that I did not receive that phonics instruction. So the Read to Succeed Act is not just one approach to this huge problem of we need to improve the literacy outcomes for the students in Kentucky. It's attacking it from multiple levels. So again, the implementation for last year was that approved screener and diagnostic and that reading improvement plans that KDE sent out a template, but schools and districts were allowed to change to suit their own needs. And next year, the reading improvement plans will be extended to 4th grade. Also, the law change the wording to say that each superintendent shall adopt a common comprehensive reading program for K through 3 for all schools or subset of a school. So that was one of the big changes that they had, that they changed the wording to shall adopt. So that is where we talk about the high quality instructional resource. And when you're looking at, well, what does that mean? A comprehensive reading program. What is a comprehensive reading program? And this is where it's going to become key for our discussion today. So a comprehensive reading program refers to instruction that includes those 5 key areas, or sometimes you might even hear them called the 5 pillars of reading: phonemic awareness, phonics, fluency, vocabulary, and comprehension. So that comprehensive reading must address those 5 key areas. And again, that's going to become important here when we start talking about it. So Kentucky really wanted to focus in on strengthening that tier 1 instruction, the instruction that all of our students get in the classroom every single day. And it starts out with that common instructional vision, that we all know what the goal is, the overarching goal for literacy. And then we go into that access to a high quality instructional resource. So if your school or district has adopted a new reading curriculum in the past couple of years, or you're getting ready to adopt a curriculum, this is where that's coming from, to strengthen that tier 1 instruction. Because I'm going to tell you something that everyone on this call already knows. You cannot intervene your way out of a tier 1 problem. I was just part of a book study and watched a session from the authors of the book Effective Universal Instruction. And one of the authors stated that if you have less than 60% of your students on grade level. So if you have 59%, if you have 59%, which is better than our rates in Kentucky, if you have 59% of your students that are on grade level, you're still not going to have enough time and enough resources to provide interventions to support those students to make the goals to reach grade level, which is kind of scary when we think about it. But having that high quality instructional resource isn't enough. That's not enough to have curriculum. Then we have to provide some high quality professional learning about how to use that. Because if not, what happens is that a teacher, there's a knock on the door and the janitor's standing out there with a dolly and there's like 5 boxes of stuff. And the teacher goes, "What is this?" And they're like, "I don't know. They just tell me that this is yours," and starts putting in the teacher's classroom all these boxes. And then it's left up to that teacher to open up all those boxes and decide, okay, this is the curriculum. This is how I'm supposed to use this curriculum. This is the purpose of this. This is what is the things that we can't leave out. These are the things that can be left out. And that teacher has to make all those decisions. So we can't just do that. We have to provide some high quality professional learning around using those resources. But even that isn't enough. We have to make sure that we have opportunities that we are looking for high quality instruction in the classrooms before we can truly realize that overarching goal to improve student experiences and their outcomes in literacy specifically. So we know that Kentucky wants to strengthen Tier 1 instruction. What is the lens for that? And so the lens for that is there have been some instructional shifts that Kentucky has looked at the research and aligning those instructional practices more closely with the research. And those instructional shifts are complex text, evidence, building knowledge, and regular and systematic approach to foundational skills. And that's where we're living at right now in the structured literacy. So all of this has been to say that's why we're talking about structured literacy. Structured literacy falls within these instructional shifts that are research-based, that is going to strengthen our Tier 1 instruction, that's going to improve the literacy outcomes for our students in Kentucky. So I've kind of shown you why. Now we're getting into the how. So we know why Kentucky's shifting. Now, how are they shifting? And the shift for structured literacy lives right within this regular and systematic approach to foundational skills. So we're going to have an opportunity to talk about what structured literacy is and what it is not. But before we do that, again, I want everyone to kind of be able to get in the right mindset. So one of the norms for today's meeting was to keep students at the center. And we have to keep our students at the center no matter what. I want you to think about a student that you have either had this past year or at some point in your past that everything that you knew how to do, you did, and they still struggled with reading. Even if you were a science teacher or a social studies teacher, you know, we know that science and social studies, if you can't read, you're going to have a really hard time in those classes as well. So I want you to think about one student that you've had in your past that no matter what you did, they were still struggling with reading. And if you don't care, humor me, will you put the initials of that student in the chat? So just the initials of that student that no matter what you did, they still struggled with reading. Now, I know that you all aren't a very chatty bunch when it comes to coming off of mute, but would anyone be willing to come off of mute and talk a little bit about that student that you're kind of keeping at your heart? Mary, would you be willing to share about your little MM?
This was a student that came from a home that had the reading. Being parents read to them, they were very much wanting to help, and the student just kept. I mean, with all the different interventions and all the different small group work and everything, the student was not being able to catch on and was able to follow the student. Not until about third grade did the student actually, it just was like it clicked at that point in time for that student. But it just didn't. It just seemed like everything we tried was not being able to work for that kid. It just wasn't sticking at that point. They were not being able to comprehend what wasn't being able to make the connections, no matter all the different strategies that we tried.
I had a student, I was trying to think this morning if it was when it was either my fifth year or my sixth year of teaching. And that was when I was teaching fourth grade. And I had this little boy, and his initials were JF. And I absolutely love this little boy. And he would have told you that he loved me and that I was his favorite person in the world. He was a little absentee problem. As a matter of fact, to get him to come to school, his mother would pull up in the parking lot at A.B. Combs Elementary, and she would call into the front office, and then the front office would call me, and I would walk out to the parking lot, and I would open the door, and most of the time, Jay would leave with me and walk into the school. And there was one time that I walked out there and I got Jay out of the car, and we walked over to the front door, and I turned around and I went to open the door for him, and he took off running. If you know where A.B. Combs Elementary School was in Perry County, it's kind of up on a hill. And before I could do anything, I did run after him, but he was a very fast student wearing tennis shoes, and I was a not very fast teacher wearing dress shoes. And he ran down the hill and jumped back in his mom's car. So he beat his mom to the bottom of the hill and went home. He wouldn't stay at school. And it wasn't that he didn't want to come to school because he didn't feel like that anyone cared. He knew that I cared. But it was because he was a non-reader. And he was very good at deflecting that he was a non-reader. He was able to write his name. He was able to read his name. He could read some very simple words, but for all intents and purposes, he was a non-reader. And he was, we gave him intervention every day that he was there. And at the end of the year that was back when it was the CATS test, he worked so hard on that reading test, but he would just look at me and he would say, I don't know what this word is. And I had to say what every teacher has ever had to say during state testing. And I had to say, baby, just do your best. And I could see that frustration. And then that affected me because I didn't know what to do to help him. And I saw him struggling, and it broke my heart, and I didn't know what to do. And I can't really understand what that feels like to be that student. Because me, probably like a lot of you on this call, I didn't have trouble learning how to read. Actually, if you ask me how I learned how to read, I really can't tell you. I remember, now I'm really showing my age, I read the Dick and Jane books, and it was the repetitive see Dick, see Jane. And then, it got really crazy when they added the dog named Spot, see Spot. And then it was see Jane run, run Jane run. And it was very repetitive with very simple words with pictures to support it. I remember reading those. And I remember figuring a lot of things out on my own when I was reading. I remember thinking things like, oh, well, this word kind of looks like this word. So I wonder if it could be this word because it looks almost exactly like the word action. So I wonder if that could be something that's like actionable. And so I made a lot of connections on my own that I wasn't necessarily taught. So sometimes it's hard for people like us to put ourselves in the place of those students that we're keeping in our hearts. So keeping that student in your heart that you said struggled to learn to read no matter what you did, um, I want you to do something with me. I want you to read this passage and I want you to tell me what it's mainly about. And when you think you know what it's mostly about, put it in the chat. What's the main idea? That's a question we ask our students all the time. What's the main idea of this passage? Go ahead and put it in the chat. What do you think this passage is about? Come on, somebody be brave and put it in the chat real quick. What do you think it's about? Plants, okay? Okay, someone else said plants. Trees. Landscape. Landscaping. So this is 70% accuracy. So this represents a zoo. This represents that if a student was only able to read about 70% of the words on that page, and then someone's asking them a question, well, what is this about? What's the main idea? So that's kind of tough to do 70%. Okay, well, what if we go to 80% accuracy? Now, what is it about? We're giving you 10% better accuracy. What's the main idea? Are you still thinking plants? Landscaping? Okay, now here's 100% accuracy. So I've seen a lot of you all said plants and landscaping. And then whenever we start to see some of these other keywords, we're able to like, oh, really kind of like zone in on, oh, well, this is about creating like a maze out of like bushes and plants and making these designs out of plants. So now reflect on that activity of seeing what it looks like to only be able to decode or know 70% of the vocabulary or even 80%. And think about those tasks that we ask our students to do, such as what's the main idea? What's a supporting detail? So how did this activity make you feel? It would have been, and how much worse would it have been if I would have started cold calling some of you all? If I would have said, Caitlin, I need you to come off of mute and tell me what the main idea of that passage is. Or Wendy, I need you to tell me what the main idea of this passage is. Now think about those students. Think about specifically students like the one that you shared their initials. And think about how those students feel every single day in a classroom setting. So we may not have had trouble learning to read. It does give you a lot more empathy. Yes. It's such an easy question. It's right there. How could you have not got it? So we may not understand ourselves personally how it feels to struggle learning to read. But now we can kind of, this helps us to be able to kind of like almost step into their shoes and to feel it. And again, how much worse would it have been if I would have started cold calling people and like called you out and asked you, well, what's the main idea? And you weren't able to tell me, or you answered something and then another kid said, that's not what it's about. Or the teacher immediately moved on and asked someone else that knew the answer. I actually watched a really impactful video, and it was from, I want to say it was like maybe from dyslexia.com. It was with dyslexia, and it was a training where they had went into a meeting with teachers, and they had very sneakily given all the teachers this passage to read. But there were a couple of teachers in the room that were given a passage that had nonsense words in them. And then the people leading the training asked the teachers to do round robin reading or read aloud reading. And the ones that, and which is kind of sneaky, because the ones that got the passage that had the nonsense words, they didn't know that everybody else had gotten a regular copy. And so whenever they struggled with the word, they let the teacher, the leaders of the training, let another person in the room give the word to them. And so, it was kind of like that, putting yourself in the position of, well, what would that feel like? What would that feel like if I thought that I had the exact same passage as everybody else, but I didn't know that word, and then someone else like very quickly gave that word? So we think about those kids. So I want you to really think about that kid that you put in your mind, your one that struggled to learn how to read no matter what you did. Because now we're actually going to get into structured literacy. So thank you all so much for participating in that. Thank you so much for your answers. So now we know that Kentucky's making these shifts to improve the literacy outcomes. And we know that one of those shifts is to address the foundational reading skills. And that our comprehensive reading program is going to include those 5 pillars, which are phonemic awareness, phonics, word recognition, fluency, and comprehension. And then you've heard a lot of, you may have even heard the term science of reading. And I want to very quickly kind of dispel something right now. When you hear people talk about the science of reading, that refers to the body of research that has been completed over 2 decades now. That is what research has shown about how the brain learns to read. That's what the science of reading is. It only refers to the research. It is not a curriculum. It is not instructional practices. So I make the distinction between the science of reading is just that research. Structured literacy is the instructional practices that align with the science of reading. So that may be the first myth that I have dispelled for you. You may have heard the science of reading, the science of reading, the science of reading, and you may have thought that that was a curriculum or instructional practices, but it's not. Structured literacy is an instructional practice that aligns with the science of reading. So we're going to have a little true or false. So if we were doing this in person, I would have you work with a group and come up with a consensus, but right now you're just going to put it in the chat. So I'm going to put a quote up, and you are going to tell me if that statement is true or false, and then we'll have an opportunity to discuss it. So are we ready? Here's your first statement. Learning to read, like learning to speak, is a natural process. So is that true or false? Just go ahead and put it in the chat. Ooh, we might have the A plus class here today. That is false. Learning to read is, in fact, a very complex process. And that science of reading, which is the scientific research that's been collected over many, 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 many years, reveals what happens in the brain to enable skillful reading. Reading is not hardwired. Those neural pathways must be developed through explicit, systematic instructional experiences. And unfortunately, with structured literacy, sometimes reading has been taught as if it's a skill to be absorbed and not a skill that needs to be explicitly taught. And we'll talk a little bit more about that. We were taught, well, if you read enough to the kids, or if you read more to kids, they'll catch up, they'll catch on. But that's actually false. So we're going to watch a very short clip about the science of reading, and it's a really short clip about the basics. And this is a lot of words that I don't know because I'm not a brain research, so I had to find a video that explains it.
What do we know about the complex process of learning to read? Surprisingly, a lot. Scientific research collected over the past 4 decades reveals what happens in the brain and what must happen in the classroom to enable skillful reading. Most children learn to walk and talk naturally without a lot of support from adults. But reading is different. Reading is not hardwired in the brain, and the neural pathways involved must be developed through successful instructional experiences. Let's look at the reading brain. The parts of the brain that allow us to process sounds and recognize visual images are already in place at birth in the left hemisphere. However, the phonological assembly region is not intact at birth. This is the part of the brain that allows us to connect speech sounds with visual images, such as letters, and enables reading. And it must be built through explicit, systematic phonics instruction and practice with decoding.
So, the part of our brain that is responsible for connecting the sounds plus that visual representation isn't even present when we're born. We have to build those pathways, which is kind of surprising if you've never heard that before. Because again, we hear a lot of times, well, if you read more to the kids, they'll catch on. And now that we have this huge, vast body of research, we know that that's not actually how the brain learns to read. Okay, so our next true or false. All students benefit from instructions in phonics and the other reading components. So very quickly in the chat, go ahead and put if that is true or false. All students benefit from instruction in phonics. Telling you all, you are the A+ students. And that is true. Actually, research supports that over 60% of our students in the regular classroom need to receive literacy instruction in a structured literacy format. So let's think about that. 60% of students need that explicit instruction on how to read. Does our data over the past years in Kentucky correlate rather strongly with that research? Yeah, because we have 50% of our students that aren't reading at a proficient level. So research supports that over 60% of students in the regular classroom need to receive literacy instruction in a structured literacy format. But it's also been shown effective for teaching all students how to read and specifically how to write. And I don't know about your school, but I don't know if I have ever been in a school where you won't hear teachers talk about my students have trouble writing. My students have trouble spelling. My students have trouble writing a complete sentence. My students have trouble writing a coherent paragraph. And we hear a lot about writing, about how our students have these gaps in writing. So when we think about that connection between the phonics, explicit phonics instruction, and how that supports their writing, and then whenever you, and I don't know about you all, I'm going to tell on myself right now. I told you I'm not a great speller. I'm not really good at spelling. And sometimes I have found myself in conversations through text message that I want to use a word and I have become overly dependent on spell check and autocorrect, but I don't know how to spell the word that I want to use. So I start typing it, but then I'm not close enough to the word for it to give me the correct spelling of the word. And do you know what I do? I pick a different word. And I'm a college educated educator. And I have those gaps. And then I had someone one time go, well, why don't you just use your text to talk? And this was somebody from like Central Kentucky. And I said, sir, do you hear my voice? Do you know how difficult it is for someone with an accent like mine is to use the text to talk feature on the phone? Because I may say something that makes perfect sense to me, and then when I look down, it has completely butchered it. So no, that doesn't work for me. But I find myself doing that. And then thinking back to that activity that I asked you to do to put yourself in the position of a student that's struggling with reading, I immediately thought, the first time I read this, I thought, oh, it's about topiary. But if I would have had to type that in a chat, I don't know if I would have typed it because I'm not 100% sure I know how to spell the word topiary. I know that word. I can read that word. I can use that word correctly in a sentence, but I don't know if I could spell that word. So when we're thinking about that connection between reading and writing and those phonics skills, all of our students are going to benefit from this. It's the helps all and harms none. So structured literacy and explicit phonics instruction and those other reading components helps all and it hurts none. So your kids that were going to learn how to read, even if you stuck them in the back of the classroom and never done anything with them, it's not going to hold them back to have structured literacy instruction. Okay, last one. Structured literacy this one's tough. Structured literacy emphasizes phonics only. True or false? This one's a little bit tougher. Structured literacy emphasizes phonics only. That statement is false. So if we look at, and I don't know if you all are familiar with this, but this is Hollis Scarborough, Dr. Hollis Scarborough, and she created this rope model to represent the complexity of learning to read. And actually her first model, she literally took pipe cleaners and she braided them together to show the complexities of everything that's involved in becoming a skilled reader that is fluent and can comprehend the text. So not just someone that is fluent, but also can comprehend this really skilled reading, that all of these things that you see to the left are all of those little pieces that go into skilled reading. And so if you look at that top rope, you're going to see that it's that language comprehension, and that's that background knowledge, vocabulary, language structure, literacy knowledge, verbal reasoning, and all those things that when you think about it, like how important it is to understanding, to comprehending. Then we have that bottom rope, which is that word recognition. So when we're talking about structured literacy specifically addresses the bottom rope of Scarborough's reading rope. So this bottom rope of phonological awareness, decoding, and encoding, and sight recognition, those are that bottom rope that goes into that skilled reading. And another model to look at to kind of think about this is this simple view of reading. So you have word recognition times language comprehension equals reading comprehension. And it's very important to note, if you know anything about multiplication, 0 times anything equals 0. So if I were to give Shane a passage that he knew a lot about, he had a really strong background knowledge about that passage, but he could only identify 70% of the words, then that reading comprehension is going to suffer. And the opposite is true as well. If you are able to decode words, but you don't have the vocabulary or the background knowledge to understand those words, then that reading comprehension is going to suffer. Think about any time as an adult that you have had to read something about which you had little to no background knowledge. One of our friends, he was in pharmacy school, so he was actually doing his rotations, his residency in pharmacy, and his rotation was at the Equine Center at the University of Kentucky, and I love him. His name's Dylan. I love Dylan very much, and he said, "Hey, Marcia, I've got this paper that I need to turn in. Do you care to proofread it for me and see if you can give me any suggestions on making it better?" And because I love Dylan like my very own son, I said, "Dylan, of course, I would be more than happy to. Send it to me right now." And he did. And it took me about 2 seconds to realize that I was not going to be of any use to Dylan on that, because it was talking about, first of all, it's talking about horse medicine. I don't really know that much about horses, and I know even less about medicine. And there was a lot of very complex vocabulary. And so my proofreading ended up being, well, you actually need a comma here. And that was about all I had to add to it. So when you think about those times where you're given something and you don't have the background knowledge, think about how difficult that is to comprehend that. And you could have asked me the most simplest question about that paper, and I wouldn't have been able to answer it. So that simple view of reading shows us that when one of these components is lacking, that reading comprehension is really going to suffer. One of my favorite people, Dr. Sharon Vaughn, she actually was the co-panel of the she wrote that it was the strategies for instruction of students with reading difficulties in grades 4 through 9. And she was talking about that comprehension is an outcome. And that was really significant to me, that comprehension is an outcome. So if your students have a deficiency in comprehension, is it really a comprehension skill that they need help with? Or is it that there is one of these other components that is missing? Is it that they don't have enough word recognition, or they don't have the vocabulary to be able to comprehend this? So it's really something to think about. So structured literacy is not just phonics. Structured literacy is phonemic awareness, phonics, word recognition, fluency, and also reading comprehension. So it's all of those strands, which goes back to that 5 components of reading that we talked about in the Read to Succeed Act. The word recognition is that phonemic awareness. And I always think of it this way: a phonemic awareness lesson in a classroom is something that could be done over the phone. It's not anything that's with paper and pencil, but is essential, because when you remember back to that reading brain, our brains are hardwired for speech. So think about that speech and how important that speech is, that speech has to be connected to the written word. So this phonemic awareness has to be addressed. And of course, the phonics. And then we have the language comprehension. And those are the 5 components of reading that was outlined in what is a comprehensive reading program. All of those are found within structured literacy. So how do the structured literacy practices, how does that look different than the typical literacy practices? So first, if you'll see that very first one, again, it talks about phonemic awareness. Phonemic awareness is covered randomly or not at all. And remember, again, that the brain learns speech before moving on to print. So that's really important. And then something that's really important, if you'll look here, sight word memorization versus high frequency words. So remember, we talked about dispelling some myths. So this might be another myth or a misconception that you may have. A sight word is any word that you know on sight. So my sight word vocabulary is very different than Caitlin's, and Caitlin's is very different than Wendy's, and Wendy's is very different than Mary. So sight words are any word that you can read just by looking at it. A high frequency word are those words that occur the most frequent in our English language, the ones that you're going to come into contact with the most. And those high frequency words can be taught not as sight words, but they can be taught according to a phonetic pattern. So you may hear there's tricky parts or hard parts, but most of those words have components that are decodable. So if you're looking at the word said, which is on the Dolch high frequency word list, the S and the D make the predictable sounds that you expect them to. The only part that students need to know by heart is that the AI in this case makes the S sound, as opposed to the long A sound that kids may be taught. So sight word memorization, and I'm not going to say that there's never an opportunity where kids can't memorize some words, but that would be high frequency words. Sight words are any word that you can read without having to sound it out. Now, I'm going to be specifically kind of focusing in on a couple of these practices. So this phonetic patterns are systematically taught following a scope and sequence. Emphasis in all letters or sounds in a word. Context clues used sparingly for irregular words or to clarify meaning after a word's been decoded. And the sounding out of words is encouraged, with misread words immediately corrected, prompting readers to attend to phonetic patterns. So, and then finally, the use of decodable text. So if you're not familiar, if you've never taught first grade or kindergarten or second grade, you may say, okay, what is a systematic scope and sequence? And what that is that as opposed to incidental phonics, which would be taking a text and using the text to determine the phonics to teach, you take a scope and sequence where you build from the most common to the most ambiguous spellings for sounds. And then it takes advantage of previous learning. So for example, a systematic scope and sequence of phonics instruction in kindergarten may begin teaching the S sound and the most common spelling of S as in sit and SS as in dress. And then first grade, students would learn more ambiguous spellings for that same S sound. The C is in bicycle, the CE is in lettuce, and the SE is in tortoise. And then finally in second grade, they would be taught the most ambiguous spellings of that same S sound, which would be the SC in scissors and the ST in listen. But it's a progression of learning that you teach those sound spelling patterns, and then you see how that the English language becomes unlocked for those students. And then it also shows us how important it is to not skip or leave out part of that learning, because that learning is built on in the next year. Kind of think about it. I like to think about it kind of like with math. You know, if students are having a difficult time, I was thinking about in my higher level math, you know, when I was in pre-calculus, I had a misunderstanding, was struggling in week 4. And then everything after week 4 built on what I was supposed to have already learned in week 4. So week 5, I had to know what it was going on in week. And so I really got lost and ended up having to drop that class because I was going to fail it. And so that systematic scope and sequence of phonics, if we leave out part, then that's going to be a gap in that knowledge. And we have to rely on whatever that high quality instructional resource you're using for your foundational skills to make sure that it is a scope and sequence of phonics instruction, that all of those gaps are being addressed so that by the time that kids make it out of 2nd grade, hopefully, they have a solid understanding of the spelling patterns. Now we go back to that not drawing students' attention away from the word itself. And you all may have heard in the news, they were talking about that there for a while, there was potential for them outlawing the 3 cueing system. And so even in that thing that I showed you with the literacy practices and structured literacy, like it gives the example of horse and pony. So if a student was reading a text and they said pony as opposed to horse, that does make sense. And that does sound right, but that's not addressing the actual letters and sounds in the word. That's making a guess. So when we're talking about that 3 cueing system, the MSV, the M is meaning, and that's always first. Does it make sense? The S is some syntax. So does that structure of it, is that a structure that we can use in the English language? And then that V is visual, and it's usually referred to as the initial visual. So if you'll notice, even in the MSV, looking at the word is the last cueing that is used. That's like the last resort for students. And so if you are having a structured literacy classroom, the first cue that a student should always use when reading is actually relying on the sounds in the word, the spelling and sound patterns in the word. So without that, students are left just guessing. And I don't know if any of you all have taught in the upper grades, but like I said, I taught in 5th grade, and I had kids in 5th grade that they would read, and if they didn't know a word, they would immediately just guess a word. And even if it didn't make not one bit of sense, they just kept on going. And breaking the habit of a student guessing a word is a very difficult habit to break. So in a structured literacy classroom, instead of encouraging a child to guess a word based on looking at the pictures or whatever, you would encourage that student to decode that word using that systematic scope and sequence of phonics instruction that they've received up until that point. So let's talk a little bit, and I see that I've got about 7 minutes left, so I think we'll be okay on time. The decodable readers. So it also specifically in a structured literacy classroom, you're going to see those decodable readers for students. And the decodable reader is kind of like the tricycle of text because it relies on just the sound and spelling patterns that a student has learned up to that point. So even a very young student can engage in meaningful independent reading when they've just learned a few sounds. So when we look at that, again, you may see one of 2 types of text in a classroom. So we have the decodable text versus a labeled reader. And so at the top, you'll see the little B, and that actually comes from Mary Ruth books. It's actually, I became introduced to the whole Danny, which Danny's a golden retriever, books through Reading Recovery. And these are labeled readers. And it relies strongly on picture clues. So this is a book that would be given to a 1st grader within the first couple of months of school. So you see that text that says, I have a toy named B. Today is B's birthday. I don't know if you've worked with 1st graders, but at the beginning of 1st grade, students would not have the knowledge necessary to decode the word toy, the word named, probably, or the word today, or the word birthday. And then if we compare that to a decodable text, you'll see those short vowel sound, that CVC and the CVC E with like, are the only words that are included in that. And so kids are using only the phonics knowledge that they have to read that text, as opposed to the leveled reader, where the words themselves kind of lend it to guessing, because a student doesn't have the knowledge of words to be able to decode that word. So you'll see from a very early age, leveled readers encourage that guessing based on the pictures. And if you've taught second grade, you know those pictures start to go away when you get in second grade and third grade and fourth grade and so on. So very quickly, this is probably the most important part. I have a short video clip, and you are going to hear from a teacher from right here in Perry County. She's a third grade teacher, and she's a third grade reading teacher, as a matter of fact. And she's going to tell you a little bit about her son, Carson.
I'm a third grade reading teacher, and my son was diagnosed with dyslexia 2 years ago. And I have a different perspective on reading and the science of reading because of what I've went through as a teacher and as well as a parent. It was really hard for someone to look at you when you're a student, when your child is in the second grade and they say your child is reading on a kindergarten reading level. And you say, but I read with him, we read every night, we practice, but he's not making any progress.
Tell me what reading was like at the beginning of the year for you.
Hard.
How did you feel whenever you was try to read? What's that mean?
Fine.
Did you like to read at the beginning of the year?
No.
How do you feel now at the end of the year?
It's okay.
How do you feel about making better progress?
Great.
But I just think that it's important for us educators to know that now that we know better, we can do better. And the research behind how the brain learns to read is important. And it's important for kids like my Carson, who is now reading at a 5th grade level in the 3rd grade. And he started out this year reading at a 2nd grade level. And he started out the year before that reading at 8.9 level, so the 9th month of kindergarten.
No.
What do you do now whenever you see words?
Try to sound them out.
And how does it work now?
Better.
So whenever you couldn't read as well as you can now, did you like school better or did you not like it as much?
Not like it as much.
And how do you feel about school now?
And of course, as you can tell, like most 9-year-old boys, he was very verbose in that. And my favorite part is whenever he said that he didn't like to read, then he kind of smiled because, his mom's a reading teacher. So, I'm sure he felt like he was kind of getting one over on her being able to say that he didn't like to read. But, that kind of brings home the point of when we know better. Oh, and this is a quote that she said, that I love. She actually heard it somewhere else. It takes a village to raise a child, but it takes a village of advocates to raise a child who struggles. So we want to make sure that we are that advocate for those kids that are struggling, that when we know better, we do better. That's one of my favorite sayings. I said that all the time in my 5th grade classroom. When you know better, you do better. And it's still one of my favorite quotes to this day. So if you would like to learn more about structured literacy, because again, this was just kind of a very short introduction, please understand that Letters Professional Learning, that cohort 3 registrations is open. It closes in August. You can read the National Reading Panel report that was published in 2000 that has a lot of the research around strategies and how the brain learns to read. You can visit the Kentucky Department of Kentucky Department of Education, the early literacy resources. And then if you're like me and you have to drive sometimes and you like to listen to podcasts, I would recommend just starting to listen to the Science of Reading, the podcast. And if you're just now starting out your journey on structured literacy, I would also highly recommend Emily Hanford's podcast, Sold a Story. So here is my email address. It's very simple to remember. It's my first name dot my last name at education.ky.gov. And I would love to thank you all so much for taking the time out of your day to spend this time with me. And I hope that I have reached the goals of my training for the day. I hope that you understand why Kentucky's making these shifts towards structured literacy. And I hope that you've learned a little bit more about what structured literacy is and why it's important for our kids. Does anyone have any questions?